Yes. Good morning. We are at Parshat Vayeira on page 99. And we're not going to get too far into it before we start looking at some sources, so I might as well pass those out at this point. Pass those down. Famous story of God coming to visit Abraham. It starts off, the Lord appeared to him, meaning Abraham, by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting in the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them. And bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, and recline under the tree. And let me fetch a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. Then go on, seeing that you have come your servant's way." They replied, "Do as you have said." And then we'll go on from there in a minute. But going back to right at the beginning, there's a difficulty that is picked up on by some of these Hasidic teachers about how the Hebrew goes. The English translates it very nicely. The Lord appeared to him, right? But the Hebrew is Vayeira elav Adonai, that he appeared to him, God, right? And that's very awkward. Even in Hebrew, like where we have we know that we do the noun first, right? And before the adjective. This construct is still very, very awkward. And so the rabbis here that I found really focus on that. Let's see what they end up gleaning from it because of it. So David, you want to read the first one?
And appeared to him Abraham God. The commentator or Chachayim asks regarding a difficulty in the text. Why is the seer, the object, Abraham, written in the verse before the one who appears, subject God? It should say, and appeared God to him. One could say this is based on the ideas of Maimonides and Guide to the Perplexed, that when it comes to the Holy One, blessed be God, it makes no sense to say there is a change, movement, or progression. So when we see this story, that, and appeared to him God, and the intent is not that the
Kadosh Baruch Hu
was uprooted from God's place, but rather God is constantly in nearness to us. And God merely reveals God's self to humans, and it is actually dependent on humans to bring themselves close to God.
Okay, so just the difficulty, if you will, with the idea of God appearing to Abraham, meaning that God left wherever God normally is, right, and comes to Abraham, right? And he's saying that in using Maimonides, right? Maimonides is also that it doesn't make any sense to say that God moves from one place to the other. God is, as we always think, God is everywhere. God is right, and doesn't need to go from one place to another. But rather, maybe what we need to do, and what they're saying Abraham does, is Abraham's got to move in some way. Right? Go ahead.
Would that be physically or spiritually?
Yes, right. Probably more spiritually than physically. Right.
We are reminded of this in the verse, "I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine." In other words, according to the preparation of a person and their connection, does one arrive at attaining the exaltation of God, and the spiritual uplift stirs for them that is able to gaze at the pleasant ways of the divine. This, as we learn, those who love me, I love, and those who seek me will find me.
Okay, so again, sort of two different ways, both I am my beloved and my beloved is mine, and then this from Proverbs, those who love me I love, and those who seek me will find me, that the people need to do the the action. The people need to do the moving instead. So this Vayeira is saying Vayeira Elav, right? That it focuses on Abraham first, as opposed to and God appeared to Abraham, but rather and to Abraham God appeared, basically. That it's got to be Abraham, the one who's more the doer. Go ahead.
In the language of the Kabbalists, on account of stirrings from below does the divine stir from above. And for this reason is the text specific when it says, and appeared to him, Abraham, God.
Right, so,
Oy
vey, right? That.
It's interesting they do the same thing in that particular sentence talking about it.
Right, well, because they keep saying it, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to, because we'll see another place where it does really change it, right? Where it changes it and says, and God appeared to Vayeira Adonai Elav, which is what we would assume, what we would think that it actually, actually it does right at the beginning, right? In the first line, first sentence, but second line, the third worded Vayeira Adonai Elav is basically how we would think that it should say it, and God appeared to him, So the Kabbalists pick up on this as well, saying that we have the power of moving God. We have the power of stirring God. It's the stirrings from below that stirs the divine above. And I think that's pretty powerful. Right? I think that so often the lament that I hear from people is, how come God doesn't talk to us the way God talked to Abraham and Isaac and Abraham, right? And God, I don't experience God, and what are you doing, right? How are you stirring yourself to bring that about? And I think that's important for us to focus on, to think about.
We haven't even gotten to the three men.
Yeah, forget about the three men, right? This is just right that God is there, right? And we know that there's the understanding that why is God there? In some way, I don't want to say it's the simple reason, but the easiest connection of why is God there in the first place. It connects back to the last part of last week's parsha, where Abraham has had his circumcision, and he's resting and recuperating. So God's there visiting the sick, right? Making a bikur cholim, a visit, so we have that answers sort of the question of why is this happening here now, and so forth. But still trying to unpack the way that it's written. So the Me'or Einayim, that first text was, you see below, was from this individual called Dvash V'Chalav. Many of the Hasidic masters were named. We get their name from like the books that they wrote and things like that. So, so he lived in Krakow, the end of the 1800s to beginning of 1900s. Me'or Einayim of Chernobyl in the mid to late 1700s, and these are the texts that I love, especially when I think about them in context to like when these rabbis were writing, America was being formed. Right? I don't normally think about it right, like that, but it's like this amazing thing that we've got these two things going on simultaneously in completely different worlds. Right? Okay, George, you want to read that? Text number 2? Nope, on the handout. Second sheet. Page 2, text 2.
Okay, and appeared to him Abraham for God. It is written plainly with pronouns and not with proper names. And God appeared to Abraham because he is meant to stand in for any given Jewish person.
Okay, so just pause. Just pause there for a minute. All right, I guess you can go on. Go ahead. That
Hashem, who is blessed, could appear to anyone at the terebinths of Mamre. Terebinth is from a word meaning strong. Mamre is from a word meaning disobedient.
Okay, so let's unpack that for a minute. So the it could have said, right, or we might have thought, Vayeira, even if we leave it in the order that it is, Vayeira Avraham Adonai, or Vayeira Adonai le Avraham, right? That God appeared to Avraham, but it doesn't say Avraham; it says to him.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's just Lord leaves that open as to who the him might be, and the Moranim says that the he is made that way to allow for us to interpret it as God appears to any individual, right? And where is God appearing to Abraham? In the terebinths of Mamre. And this word terebinths, it's hard for us. A lot of times we talk about these as these specific kinds of trees or something like that, right? But it has a sense of strength, of being strong. And Mamre, the place, also comes from the language of Mari, which means disobedient, right? So what does it mean that God's coming to visit somebody in some ways who is strong in their disobedience, right? So before we go on, what can that mean to us?
God still reaches out to the sinner.
Right, great. So even if we're in this place of real disobedience, right, and digging our heels in, God's still going to appear to us. Right? In some ways, God's going to be connected to us. So let's see if that's where he goes. George.
Even when a person has produced bitter language attacking God, God sees it. When that person has thoughts of penitence, now they are sitting at the opening of the tent, and the opening of repentance is created for them. And thus, and he lifted his eyes, and behold, there were three men coming towards, that is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he ran to greet them. This is when a person's actions have arrived at the spiritual level of the actions of our fathers.
Right. So, right.
Abraham is sitting there seeing these three men, but one of them is Abraham.
Well, when we see these three men, right, when we in some ways lift up our eyes, right, change our behavior, that we then, the images maybe that we have are of our ancestors, and that we're connecting back to them. But that when Abraham is sitting at the opening of the tent, again, leaving it as any individual, not just Abraham, he's saying that sitting at the opening tent means that there's this opening for tshuva, there's this opening for repentance. And when we actually lift up our eyes, that's when we are starting to make the change, that our spiritual activities are connecting back to really allow us to make that tshuva, to really make those changes. Go ahead.
The question arises in my own mind is, why did God need three people to represent him? Why couldn't it be just one person?
Right.
Oh, whatever.
It's a great question. So one of the answers that's given is that we move to understand these three as angels, right? As messengers of God. And one of the traditions is that each angel has a specific task. So we'll see in a little bit that three of them come, and one of them tells Abraham and Sarah that they're going to have a child. And then two of them go on to Sodom and Gomorrah. So where's the third? What happened to the third? And the answer that the rabbis give is that the third sort of returned back because his task was done. And so there's two other tasks that are going to need to get done. So that's why you needed three different individuals, three angels. On a more simple level, I could say, well, if someone's traveling through the desert, right, you're not traveling alone, right? You're going to go with others. Traveling by yourself on a long journey back then was probably not the wisest thing to do. And so I could imagine that, you'd be in at least a small group of people. So that's sort of more of a social understanding of it. Great. Okay, another explanation on this. Len.
and appeared to him Abraham, God. God's presence stands out and Abraham sits. Rather, this reveals God's humility. And in Bereshit Rabbah it says, Reb Barachiah, in the name of Reb Levi, says, sitting is what is written. Abraham requested to stand, but God told him to sit. This is a sign to your descendants. Just as you sit and the Shekinah, God's presence, stands, so to your descendants sit, and God rests upon their shoulders. When Israel enters into the Beit Knesset and the Beit Midrash and call out the Shema, and they sit for God's honor, and God's presence is on their backs. That from here is the custom to prepare a chair at the Brit Milah ceremony.
So there are some different questions as to how you should be, right, when you say the Shema. There's one story that's told of a new rabbi that comes to town, and when the congregation gets to the Shema, some people sit and some people stand, and the people that are sitting are yelling at the people that are standing. What are you doing standing? You should be sitting, and this is the right way to do it, right? And the people that are standing are yelling at the people that are sitting. You should be standing. That's the right way to do it, right? And so eventually the young rabbi goes to visit an older congregant in the hospital, and in their conversation says, I've come and I've seen this going on for quite a while. I'm trying to figure out what the custom of the congregation is. So the man says, well, tell me what's happening. He says, well, we get to the Shema, and the people that are sitting yell at the people that are standing. The people that are standing yell at the people that are sitting. And the man says, that's the tradition of the congregation. But there's some people have. I think we certainly see that in, most Reform congregations. They stand for the Shema. But I've really only seen people sitting in most others. My understanding, I'd have to go back and find exactly the sources, but that through the Talmud and all, is that basically you do it in the way that you already are, right? That you don't change your position in order to say it. And so since we're already sitting for the things that come up before the Shema, you remain sitting. If you were standing, saying your prayers, standing at, even whether it be personally or as the leader, standing at some sort of a podium, as some people do. Some people have like we've got a stender, right? They might have it in their office or something like that, and that's where they stand to do mincha in the afternoon or some other prayers. If you're already standing, then you remain standing. You don't go then to move and sit down just specifically for the Shema. You stay in the same position that you are. So, but here is sort of going with the understanding that we sit for Shema, but could say why, right? We're speaking about God, and maybe the more respectful thing to do would be to stand, just as Abraham wants to stand. And so here we have this connection between Abraham, which we're being told was told to sit when God came, even though he wanted to get up, so that it sort of teaches us that that's the right thing for us to do, and that that God is resting upon us, right, while we are saying the Shema.
We actually had a discussion about this in this congregation about 12, 15 years ago.
Oh, yeah?
About what we should be doing. We just saw that sitting was more a position of humility.
Right.
And so that would be the proper attitude for it.
Right, so which is interesting in that case, right? It really starts. This text starts off talking about God's humility. So in some ways, then us saying the Shema sitting is emulating God as well, right? That we're expressing the humility that God expressed during this time.
When a woman comes in to people sitting at a table,
mm-hmm.
everyone usually stands.
There are those
out of respect.
Right.
So I think that's where the conflict occurs.
Sure.
The professor comes in.
Yeah, you stand.
Right. I mean, I know most
You
people.
can
Most people stand when I walk in the room.
Yes,
Conductor comes in.
yes. Right.
When a conductor comes in front of an orchestra,
They all stand up.
Yep.
A judge, right? A judge walks in, right? People stand. What other situations? I mean, I certainly in some traditional classrooms we think about, right? Then when the teacher came in, people would stand. And I've seen that in more orthodox settings, in a yeshiva or something like that, where the rabbi walks in the room, the students will at least go something like that. Right? They'll do a little bit of a motion. What are any other situations we can think of?
I think is a Sephardic tradition where when a member of the family has an aliyah, the other members of the family in the congregation
stand up during the aliyah. Yeah.
It's interesting, they mentioned a Rabbi Menachem Twersky
right.
of Chernobyl.
Right.
There's a whole group of Twerskys in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm not sure, I don't know the lineage and who traces back, but yeah.
Interesting.
Right. This rabbi here, haven't yet been able to find who Harav Dalad Shin is. You see that at the end of the Hebrew text. It's got the citation, but haven't been able to figure out who that is yet.
Why not stand when the Torah is being read?
It's an interesting question. Some people do have that custom. Right? Some people do have that custom. They will, and it varies in different ways. Some people will stand for the bracha and then sit down while the actual Torah is being read. And some people stand for almost the entirety of the Torah reading. We do it a couple of times throughout the year when specific things are read. The one that in some ways connects to this is the giving of the Ten Commandments. That when that's read in the synagogue, we stand up. That it's a reenactment, that we were standing at Mount Sinai. My understanding is that the difference is, do we see the Torah reading as a reenactment of Mount Sinai, or do we see it as a time of study, right? Depending upon how we see it, that determines whether we stand for it or not.
I mean, in days gone by, these rabbis, they studied all day, right? And so that would be arduous to be on. To be
standing the whole time, right? Right. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think they probably stood or sat as they felt comfortable, right?
And it's a form of study for the congregation as the Torah is being read and you're following.
Right.
It's a form of study.
Right.
And when we study, you don't think of ourselves at the table standing, studying.
Right. Again, depending. I mean, certainly in you'll see depictions and I've experienced in yeshivot or whatever where people will at least periodically stand up, especially if you've been sitting all day, right? Just the opposite, like you want to stand for part of it. There are these more movable little stenders that you could like put your book up on at the table, and then what people will do sometimes is set it up on its side and put your book on top of it and stand up for a little while and just to be able to move around. Sitting the whole time is really hard as well. So
the people at the shulchan are standing the whole time.
Right. Yeah, a little of that. Okay, let me see. I think we have one more. We have one more. Text number 4. Charity.
And appeared to him God. Abraham was degraded in his eyes so much that he thought in his heart that he was not fit for the inspiration of the Shekinah. But rather he is the tzaddik who serves God, and to him God passes. And appeared to him. It seems to Abraham that God appeared to him because God was at the terebinth of Mamre, and Abraham sat in the entrance of the tent. He himself was still outside the opening of his holiness.
Right, so in some ways, like if we reenacted what this looks like, it gives us a sense that God maybe is inside the tent and Abraham's outside. If we see inside the tent, meaning inside holiness, and God is outside of, and Abraham is outside of the holiness still. He's not yet in there. and thus, in some ways, Abraham has positioned himself in a particular place, right? Outside. We can read the text that he's sitting in the entrance of his tent, could be inside, could be outside, right? But I think this one is reading it that he's outside, as a way of saying, I'm not yet worthy to really be in the presence of God. Great. Okay. And now let's, a lot on that one section. Let's move along and see what these messengers, angels, are going to do. Edith, on page 100, verse 6. On the right-hand side.
Yes.
Yeah, got it?
Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 sticks of choice flour, knead and make cakes." Then Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and choice, and gave it to a servant boy, who hastened to prepare it. He took corn and meat and the calf that had been prepared and set this before them. And he waited on them under the tree, and they ate.
Okay, we have this real rushing around, right? The English does a great job where he says to Sarah, "Quick, 3 seahs of choice flour, knead and make cakes," right? And like dropping any kind of, take, right? It doesn't even say take 3 seahs of choice flour, knead it and make cake. Like drops out a few words that we would expect to be in there. Gives a little bit more of that sense of urgency. Okay, go on.
They say to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he replied, "They are in the tent." Then one said, "I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the period of woman. And Sarah looked to herself, saying, "Now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband's soul?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah look, saying, Shall I in through bear a child, old as I am? If anything too wondrous for the Lord, I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah shall have a son." Sarah lied, saying, "I did not look," for she was frightened. But he replied, "You did look."
Okay, so we've got this interaction between the angels and Abraham, but we also have the back and forth bringing God into it as well, right? So at the near the beginning, verse 10, one of the angels, one of the messengers says, "I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Right? But then down below, it's in verse 14, God speaking, right? "Is anything too wondrous for the Lord? I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah will have a son." So we see this conflation of, is it God? Is it an angel, right? Is it live or is it Memorex? So we have that going on, and then we have this whole thing with Sarah. She's in the tent. She's listening on some level. God speaks directly to her, but then goes back to Abraham, and here Sarah says to herself, right, "I'm withered. Am I to have enjoyment? My husband is so old." And God turns that around when God speaks to Abraham, and says that she said, when I, Sarah, am so old. And there's a little bit of a play there. And then she feels accused and caught about the laughter. Although, if we go back into last week's parsha, we see that as well, and I believe it's Abraham who does the laughing. And from that, it's already decreed that the child's name is going to be Isaac. If I find it quickly, I don't know, but that's the recollection of it. Right, Abraham, this is back in last week's. Abraham threw himself on his face and laughed, as he said to himself, can a child be born to a man 100 years old, or can Sarah bear a child at 90, right? So we get that. Is it Abraham who laughed? Is it Sarah who laughed? There's a lot of uncertainty of what's really going on. Fantastic. Page 102, Andy. The men set out.
The men set out from there and looked down toward Sodom, Abraham walking with them to see them off. Now the Lord had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him? For I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grave. I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note. The men went on from there to Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham came forward and said, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? And the Lord answered, if I find within the city of Sodom 50 innocent ones, I will forgive the whole place for their sake. Abraham spoke up, saying, here I venture to speak to my Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. What if the 50 innocent should lack 5? Will you destroy the whole city for want of 5? And he answered, I will not destroy if I find 45 there. But he spoke to him again and said, what if 40 should be found there? And he answered, I will not do it for the sake of the 40. And he said, let not my Lord be angry if I go on. What if 30 should be found there? And he answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, I venture again to speak to my Lord, what if 20 should be found there? And he answered, I will not destroy for the sake of the 20. And he said, let not my Lord be angry if I speak but this last time. What if 10 should be found there? And he answered, I will not destroy for the sake of the 10. When the Lord had finished speaking to Abraham, he departed, and Abraham returned to his place.
Okay, so here we have this back and forth with God and Abraham. The first question asked is God sort of thinking to the divine self, should I keep what I'm planning on doing from Abraham? Right? And decides that the best thing to do is to reveal it to him. The language is interesting. The Lord said, the outrage of Sodom is so great and their sin so grave, I will go down to see if they've acted according to the outcry that's reached me. If not, I will take note. Like, it doesn't say I'm going to destroy the city, right? So it's in some ways Abraham is interjecting, right? This whole idea of God of God destroying the cities and the people. But it certainly seems to be accurate, right? Because God goes along with that line of questioning then. Two lines stand out in some of the things that Abraham says. One is that, far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly, right? It's like, I remember in Field of Dreams, right? And Kevin Costner goes to meet up with James Earl Jones's character, and he goes in and he's trying to convince him to go with him to the baseball game, and James Earl Jones, I forget what his name is, his character is going after Kevin Costner's character, and eventually Kevin Costner says, you're a pacifist, right? And it's like, I've got to remind you who you are, right? And and Abraham's doing sort of the same thing. God, you're the judge of all the earth. Like, you have to act in a just way. So that's one situation. And the other then is Abraham saying, I'm going to speak up, but I am but dust and ashes, right? And that's the next text that we have on the handout, saying, but I am but dust and ashes. And it says in text 5 at the bottom of page 3, Reb Simcha Bunim of Peshischa taught on this verse that one should have 2 pockets. In one, a note saying, I am but dust and ashes, and in the other, a note saying, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, for my sake the world was created. Reb Simcha Bunim derives the inscription on the second note from the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, the Holy One, blessed be He, fashioned every man in the stamp of the first, and yet none of them resembles his fellow. Therefore, every single person is obliged to say the world was created for my sake. So having in each pocket, right, one note, one little piece of paper, and one that says, I am but dust and ashes, and then the other one says, for me the world was created. And we can understand that those two things, that having those two, what do they call them? There's a word in sort of, self-help stuff, some sort of,
Alternatives.
no, they're not alternatives, but some sort of statement that you read to what's that? Affirmation, thank you. These 2 affirmations, right, that are polar opposites. Right? I am but dust and ashes, and for me the world was created. But to have those 2 affirmations in front of you at, in some ways not right in front of you, right? They're stuck in your pockets, but you know that they're there. He goes on then to say, and I think this is an interesting point that I haven't really thought of before. One should know how to use the notes in the right time and place, and not, as he cautions many do, in the opposite context, right? So when do you take out which note, right? When do you reach your hand into the pocket? It's not you have 2 of them in one pocket, and randomly pull one out and see which one is important to you to be thinking about at any given time, right? So which should I be thinking I'm but dust and ashes, or should I have been thinking that I'm for me the world was created? But you know which one's in which pocket. The question is, which statement do you need to be internalizing at any given time, right? And that was interesting for me, sort of pointing that out here.
Feeling arrogant.
Right. So that's easy, right? When you're feeling arrogant, right, you might say, I need to be brought down a little bit. I am but dust and ashes, right? And when you need to, almost when you need to stand up for yourself, right? When you need to get what you really need. Say, I deserve this. For me, the world was created, right? And being able to know to pull that one out at other times.
Question?
Yeah.
Why stop at 10? Why not? I would.
Oh, good question. So one of the answers, and I think it says down below, under the line on page 104, why does Abraham stop at 10?
Oh.
Perhaps it takes a critical mass to generate an alternative way of living. Isolated individuals cannot. Right? So that in itself is just a place to stop, right? It goes on to say the number 10 may be psychologically related to the stipulation of 10 people for a minyan, the quorum for public worship, the point at which an assembly of individuals becomes a group, a congregation. And the proof for 10 for a minyan doesn't really come from here. It comes more from the 10 of the scouts that come back from scouting out the land of Canaan. 2 had a positive response, and 10 of them had a negative response. And that again, sort of seeing here, like, what does 10 people together do, making a critical mass to then be able to convince the rest of the population that we can't do this, right? We can't go into the land. That 10 seem to have some sort of a power. So, same thing, like in Sodom, had there been 10 people, God might have said, you know what? There's enough people there to turn the place around, right? You need that critical mass to make some sort of change. That one or two people on their own, Lot and his wife and their kids, they couldn't have done it, right? They couldn't have had that kind of impact that 10 people could have had. So it seems like it has something to do with that.
It's slightly different from the argument that God uses with Jonah to justify his not destroying Nineveh.
Right, and with Jonah, God leaves open and presents the possibility of the people repenting, right? Go down, tell them I'm going to destroy the city, right? Abraham going is not to warn the people. Abraham going is merely to extract Lot and his family, right? We'll get to that. Jonah, the intention is, I want to save this place, right? Again, could we get to have an understanding that Sodom and Gomorrah were past that, right? God didn't, it was irredeemable in some way. Or does God learn from these early instances of the flood, right, of Sodom and Gomorrah, that when it comes time to Nineveh, realizes, better to offer up repentance than to just go in and wipe out the place. So maybe it's a progression in some way.
But with Jonah, it sounds like God is speaking of the inhabitants of Nineveh in a different way. They don't know the right hand from the left. And and should I do this to them when they're so helpless?
Right. And maybe, right, Sodom is seen differently in that they are, the Midrashim at least, are show us that they were really like wicked to the core, right? One of the, again, we sort of get into it from the story, is that it was against the law, right, to welcome in travelers and give them a place to rest for the night, right? It's not just, okay, nobody does it, right? But it's against the law, right? That they were intentionally making things, doing the wrong things, as opposed to, as you say, maybe in Nineveh, that they just didn't know, right?
But here there might be some who are worthy of being saved.
A small group, right? To wrap this up, on the back page, there's this section from Martin Buber. It says, Martin Buber develops this notion: every person should know and consider the fact that you, in the particular way you were made, are unique in the world, and no one like you has ever been. For if someone like you had already been, there would be no reason for you to be in this world. Actually, everyone is something new in this world, and here we must work to perfect our particular being. For because we are still imperfect, the coming of the Messiah is delayed. So, in some ways, brings these two things together, that we are, for us, the world is created, right? We're unique, and we need to be doing important things and the right things in the world, but also we're but dust and ashes. We're imperfect, and having to bring those two things together as well.
Well, may I add?
Yeah.
Regarding a person's uniqueness, is it science has said that for every person born, 1 in 400 million chance.
1 in 400 million chance
Of being here. So that's the 1 in 400 million, because of all they said, of all the things that they have to take into consideration, war, all these, things that would have risk of you not being here in this world.
Okay.
It's interesting.
I don't know where that comes from. Okay. Great. So now we have, now we're going to see in chapter 19 where we're going from these two angels, from 3 angels to 2 angels. So page 104, George, chapter 19.
The 2 angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to greet them, and bowing low with his face to the ground, he said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house to spend the night, and bathe your feet, then you may be on your way early." But they said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned his way and entered his house. he prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate.
Okay, so many connections between this and Abraham, right? Where's he sitting? In the gate of Sodom, just as Abraham was sitting in the entrance of his tent. And maybe in making a similar connection to the text that we learned earlier, is that maybe he needs to position himself outside of Sodom, right, on a regular basis, because he doesn't want to be influenced, right, by Sodom as much, right? So distance himself, stay aside, just as Abraham was outside, not feeling the being able to be that inside of God's holiness at that time, right? And just as Abraham went to greet the angels, the messengers, here too, Lot goes and greets them. Please, my lords, turn to your servant's house, spend the night with us, right? Let me take care of you, just as Abraham took care of them before. And ultimately they decide to go with him. Go on, George.
They had not yet lain down when the townspeople, the men of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last man, gathered about the house. And they shouted to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may be intimate with them." So Lot went out to them to the entrance, shut the door behind them, and said, "I beg you, my friends, do not commit such a wrong. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please." But do not do anything to these men, since they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they said, "Stand back. The fellow," they said, "came here as an alien, and already he acts the ruler. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the person of Lot and moved forward to break the door. But the men stretched out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And the people who were at the entrance of the house, young and old, they struck with blinding light, so that they were helpless to find the entrance.
Okay, so the men go in, and Lot tries to protect them. A very difficult text around him offering up his daughters instead of the men. But ultimately, none of that has to happen, because the men bring him inside and strike down the people with this blinding light as protection. When we talk about the questioning of who was good in the town, it points out rather specifically that nobody was, right? That the townspeople, the men of Sodom, old and young, all the people to the last man, right, came. Right? There was nobody else that was stepping aside from this, that was saying this is the wrong thing to do, right? Everybody was wrapped up in it, coming against Lot and ultimately his family, who we assume was all inside there. Go ahead, Len.
Then the men said to Lot, "Whom else have you here? Sons-in-law, your sons and daughters, or anyone else that you have in the city, bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against them before the Lord has become so great that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his son-in-law as one who jests. As the dawn broke, the angels urged Lot on, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 remaining daughters, lest you be swept away because of the iniquity of the city." Still he delayed. So the men seized his hand and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters in the Lord's mercy on him, and brought him out and left him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, one said, "Flee for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, lest you be swept away." But Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lord, you have been so gracious to your servant, and have already shown me so much kindness in order to save my life, but I cannot flee to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Look, that town there is near enough to flee to. It is such a little place. Let me flee there. It is such a little place, and let my life be saved." He replied, Very well, I will grant you this favor too, and I will not annihilate the town of which you have spoken. Hurry, flee there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Hence the town came to be called Zor. As the sun rose upon the earth, and Lot entered Zor, the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah sulfurous fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he annihilated those cities and the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation off the ground. Lot's wife looked back, and she thereupon turned into a pillar of salt. Next morning Abraham hurried to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and looking down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the plain, he saw the smoke of the land rising like the smoke of a kiln. Thus it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain and annihilated the cities where Lot dwelt, God was mindful of Abraham and removed Lot from the midst of the upheaval.
Okay, so we have this couple different things. One is that it doesn't say specifically that the sons-in-law don't go, but it does say that the man seized his hand, Lot's hand, and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters, right? That they end up only taking out Lot, his wife, and his daughters. The question is why the son-in-laws don't come. They did seem to they did seem to think that Lot was a little bit off of his rocker there, or that this messenger was. Because said, but he seemed to his sons-in-law as one who jests. So maybe that's why they're not there, that they weren't going along with it. And later on, in just a minute, we'll see how the daughters react because of that. Right? The daughters think they're the last people on earth, and want to start all over again. And the other thing is, I always thought, and again, things that jump out at me at different times of reading it, that there's a warning, right? Don't look back. But there really isn't. And yet, when his wife looks back, she turns into a pillar of salt, right?
I thought it was also, Rabbi, I thought they were told not to look.
Yeah. I was looking for that, and it's not there, right? All of a sudden, there's just this punishment or whatever, right? Or consequence, right?
It says, do not look behind you.
Where?
Yeah, it said
Page
somewhere.
107.
Oh, it did.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Don't look behind you. Okay, so we do have that. Okay, good. Phew! I was like, I always thought that was there.
They got their warning.
Okay, thank you, George.
Rabbi, is this still Hashem? Is this Hashem was the one who?
Well, it's really, again, it's this from the beginning, right? And we didn't go into it. We didn't go into it as when Abraham sees them. Does he already know that it's God? Right? Does he think that it's just 3 travelers? Right? There's a lot of uncertainty in some of the language, and we could really unpack that using some of the other rabbinic texts. But there is a very back and forth of these messengers being angels or being God, the divine itself, and it's messy in terms of that, right? Which is fine, right? In some ways we're okay with that, right? That they're one and the same, which we have in other places as well. We have it with the angel that stops near the end of this parsha, which we're not going to get to, right? Which stops Abraham from killing Isaac, right? Is it God? Is it an angel? The angel in front of Bilam's donkey, right? Is it God or is it an angel? Right? There's a lot of uncertainty or conflation with those things. Okay, let's finish up this story here with the daughters. Charity, page 108, verse 30. Page 1, yeah. Got it?
Lot went up from Zor and settled in the hill country with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zor. And he and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. And the older one said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to consort with us in the way of all Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father. That night they made their father drink wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. The next day the older one said to the younger, See, I lay with the father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you'll go and lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father. That night also they made their father drink wine, and the younger one went and lay with him. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Thus the two daughters of Lot came to be the child by their father. The older one bore a son named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. The younger also bore a son, and she called him Ben-Ammi. He is also the father of Ammonites today.
Okay, so we have the start of some of these other peoples that we're going to hear about later on, the Moabites and the Ammonites, and they come from this relationship between Lot's daughters and Lot, thinking that they're the last ones on earth, right? They see these cities that have been destroyed. Their husbands didn't come with them, right? And they, what's that?
They didn't have husbands.
Yeah, the sons-in-law.
No, it's the two daughters who were not married.
Who were virgins.
The ones who had.
He offered.
Oh, so Lot went on who had married his daughters instead of.
He had other daughters who were.
I see. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
So there are more, and
weren't there men in Zor?
two remaining daughters, right? Evidently not, right? I don't know what Zoar was.
It's a small region near. I think that would have been destroyed too if.
Well, no,
not
because
for
that's
Lot.
where they fled.
That's where they went to.
But the angel said, I will not destroy it because you asked to flee there.
Yeah, but it could be just a place rather than a settlement.
Right. Yeah. In 108, Lot went up from Zoar. It is not known why Lot was afraid to stay in Zoar. Perhaps earth tremors continued to be felt there. Later sources have preserved a tradition that all 5 cities of the plain, including Zoar, were destroyed. This would explain why Lot's daughters believed the catastrophe was universal. Right? They really thought that it was everywhere.
Two daughters.
No, it's
Daughters
Yeah,
who
he has
married
two
are
daughters.
killed, right?
he has more than that, right? He has
Yeah.
more than that. Right, reading it closer, that there's 2 that weren't married, 2 unmarried daughters. The married ones stayed behind, right?
Killed with their husbands.
And died with their husbands, right? And then it says, right, take your wife and your 2 remaining daughters, lest you be swept away. Yeah, so he had more children, more daughters, or specifically daughters. We don't know about any sons. Great. And then we go on with Abraham involved with another king, and going back with Sarah as his sister again. We find that a second time. And then Sarah has Isaac, and we get into the interplay between Isaac and Ishmael. And then the end of the parsha is the Akedah, is God telling Abraham to take Isaac to a mountain and to offer him up. And then, of course, we know where God stops him right before the end of that. So that's the conclusion of the Torah.
So there's no consequence to Lot or his daughters for their actions?
Well, there is later on some things where the Israelites were not supposed to be in relationship with the Ammonites and the Moabites.
And they can also go into the temple to like one generation.
Yeah, there is some stuff, and so maybe it connects back
So
to
it's not
this.
forgotten.
It's not necessarily forgotten, right? And yet, right, the one big difference, right, is that Ruth, right, is a Moabite. And Ruth ends up being the grandmother of King David.
But how many generations do you think she was from Rabbi? Because
Who
probably
knows? But
doesn't-
well, yeah, but I think there was still the tradition at that point that they weren't supposed to be with the Ammonites and the Moabites. So, so it's this interesting tension that we there is a consequence, but there's also where a Moabite ends up being the grandmother of our famous King David.
If the 2 year olds each had sons, then how did they proceed from there?
Yeah, well, I mean, those are the questions we have those questions very early on, right? That Adam and Eve only had Cain, Abel, and then Seth afterwards, right? So we only hear about boys, but there's midrashim as to how things continued on otherwise. And you could say, well, they thought they were the last ones on earth, but their children, they then had sons, right? And they grew up and they realized, oh, there are other people out here, right? So by that time, maybe they found more to continue on with. So, thank you all, and see you next week.
We don't know the name of Lot's wife, right?
Right. It's just Lot's wife. Lot's wife, for the most part, Noah's wife, although there's a tradition, I think her name was Naamah. We have a few places where the women are just referred to as so-and-so's wife, so-and-so's daughter.
We don't even know Lot's father's name, who was Abraham's brother.
I think Nahor.
Yeah, I think we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got that.